hung, o nga hung, bent guru pemas zidi hung, o nga hung, guru pemas zidi hung. Hello everyone, and welcome to my Sunday afternoon Dharma talk here at the Buddhist Center, Sunday 2 o'clock, second lifetime. Welcome all, namaskar. Today we're going to be discussing the 29th Sutta of the Digha Nikaya in our continuing series on the first book of the Sutta Pitaka. There are 34 suttas, as probably most of you know by now, in the book, so we're coming to the end of the series of talks. Today's talk is the Pasadika Sutta, which I'm translating as the Beauteous Discourse. This sutta takes place where the Buddha, actually before I read it, just in case any of you are new, please feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have a question. I think it's better to ask the question when it occurs to you rather than waiting till the end. Also, today's talk will take about 40 minutes, and we'll conclude with a question and answer and dedication of merit. So, this sutta takes place when the Buddha is staying in the Shakyan territory amongst his own people, towards the end of his life, but presumably prior to the Kosalan genocide of the Shakyans. Schumann says that this genocide occurred 1 or 2 years before the year of the Buddha's death, so it must have been a little bit before that when this sutta took place. The Buddha says, quote, "Now I am an aged teacher of long standing, an aged teacher of long standing, who went forth a long time ago, and my life is coming to its close." Unquote. One of those suttas that we can more or less put in some sort of chronological order. The sutta further states that, quote, "At that time, the Niganta Nataputta had just died at Pawa," unquote. Pawa is, of course, a Jain stronghold in the state of Mala to the south of the Shakyan territory, neighboring. The Buddha would also travel through Pawa shortly before his death, several years later. It was here that he ate the famous meal of pig's delight, offered to him by Chunda the blacksmith. Pawa was located near present-day Fazil Nagar. I have no idea how that's pronounced, but that's what it looks like anyway. Fazil Nagar in Kushinagar district of the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, of course. That's the present-day location, the name of the area. Niganta Nataputta is the name given in the Pali Canon to Vardhamana Mahavira, the 24th and last guide. The Sanskrit word is Tirthankara, of Jainism, who we shall refer to henceforth as Mahavira. And I think this is the first reference that we've seen in the Digha Nikaya to Mahavira. Actually, I take that back. I think he has been alluded to before. The historical origin of Jainism is obscure, but probably goes back to the 8th and 9th centuries before the Common Era. Walsh is certainly an error, possibly a typo in the book, but Walsh, our translator, of course, ascribes the years 540 to 568 before the Common Era to Mahavira. This is certainly a mistake, because it would make Mahavira only 28 at his death. Possibly it's not Walsh's error, and it's an actual typographical mistake in the book. In any case, if you're following along in Walsh's translation, you may have noticed that, and it is definitely incorrect. According to tradition, Mahavira left home at the age of 30, practiced meditation and asceticism for 12 and a half years before attaining enlightenment, and died at the age of 72. Similar, actually, to the Buddha. Slightly different dates, but very similar succession of events to the Buddha himself. And there's a lot of similarities, actually, between Jainism and Buddhism. Both that and some doctrinal similarities, and also a number of iconographic similarities as well. In fact, you'll see one of the similarities if you go to look at my blog at www.palisuttas.com. The talk's automatically scheduled to post at 5 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, so it's just posted. And the image that appears at the beginning of the blog, you may think is the Buddha. In fact, it's an image of Mahavira. The Jains themselves believe that Mahavira was born in 599 before the Common Era. That's the orthodox date that you'll read in the literature, but scholars reject this date as too early, much as they reject the Theravada date for the birth of the Buddha in 624 before the Common Era, which no one accepts anymore. Walsh notes that Mahavira is generally believed to have died after the Buddha. He doesn't give a textual source for this, so I'm not sure if it's in the Pali Canon or somewhere else. But this sutta clearly states that he died before the Buddha, and for our purposes, that's what we're interested in. The Ancient History Encyclopedia, which is an online encyclopedia that is usually quite accurate and useful, states that the accepted date of Mahavira's death is about 467 before the Common Era, whereas the Buddha's birth was between 490 and 450 before the Common Era, which would put the Buddha's death between 410 and 370, the latter being the currently accepted range. This is the increasingly prevalent view, and it's the view that I use always in my writings and talks. Other Jain sources revise the death of Mahavira as 474 to 467 before the Common Era. Clearly, the two dates are mutually incompatible. Since Sutta 2 represents Mahavira, so there you are, he has appeared in before. Sutta 2 represents Mahavira as being alive about the time that King Ajatasattu and others consulted the Buddha. So there's a discrepancy there between the dates, and there's a paper there for someone, if they're interested in doing the research. The suttas of the Pali Canon consistently present the Buddha and Mahavira as contemporaries who were known to each other, although I don't believe there's any indication that they ever actually met, and whose lives thus overlapped. Thus, we must place Mahavira's birth between about 485 and 445 before the Common Era, approximately. A.K. Narain, in his review of the dating of the historical Buddha, says, quote, "The Jain tradition gives a date of 155 years after the death of Mahavira for the coronation of Chandragupta, whose dates are generally given as 340 to 298 before the Common Era, and he was the founder of the Maurya Empire, which we can date around 320 BC, according to Narain. We have a firm connection between Stulabhadra, whose dates are generally given as 297 to 198 BCE, and he was a Jain disciple of Acharya Bahu, and Chandragupta's immediate predecessor Nanda, whose dates are generally given as 400 to 329 BCE. He was the first king of the Nanda dynasty. And we have a date of 170 years after the death of Mahavira for the death of Stulabhadra's predecessor, the sixth Jain patriarch, Bhadrabahu. He therefore died about 15 years after Chandragupta's coronation. By taking an average figure of 15 years for each of the six patriarchs, we can date the death of Mahavira 75 years before the coronation of Chandragupta, that is, about 395 BC. We shall probably not be far out if we assume that both Mahavira the Jina and Gautama the Buddha died within the period of 10 years either side of 400 BC, unquote, which brings Mahavira and Buddha now into into conformity with each other, with a death date of around 400 BCE, which is, as I said, the current prevalent view. After Mahavira's death, the sutta presents the Jain order as being riven by internal dissension. Just after the end of the rainy season in October-November, the novice Chunda, not to be confused with Chunda the blacksmith, the novice Chunda, comes to Samagama to see Ananda, the personal attendant of the Buddha, of course, and tells him all this, whereupon Ananda and Chunda go to tell the Buddha about Mahavira's death. The Buddha's response is that Mahavira was unenlightened and his doctrine and discipline ill-proclaimed, unedifyingly displayed, and ineffectual in calming the passions because it is impossible to live by it. As a result, the practitioner, the disciple, gains much demerit. Possibly, the Buddha is referring to the Jain emphasis on abstinence from all actions based on the doctrine that action, and not intention, is the cause of karma, and this includes both negative and positive actions. Positive actions also ultimately create karma, and therefore enslave the individual to rebirth. And this is, of course, the classical Indian view that the Buddha rejected. Such a view is, of course, impossible to carry out in practice, as I have discussed elsewhere in these talks, so I'm not going to elaborate that further. The Buddha then compares himself and his Sangha to Mahavira and his Sangha, to the detriment of the latter. The Buddha discusses the merit or demerit of teachers, doctrines, and disciples in terms of the enlightenment or non-enlightenment of the teacher, the doctrine and the discipline being well or ill proclaimed, and the practice or non-practice by the disciple or disciples, and the praiseworthiness or blame and the merit or demerit of all these various factors. As you're probably realized by now, the Pali Canon loves to classify things. Next, he discusses the sadness or non-sadness arising from the death of the teacher in these various circumstances, as a function of the understanding by the disciples of the Dharma and the discipline. Finally, he discusses the perfection or imperfection of the practice of the holy life as a function of the seniority of teachers. These last 2 points pertain specifically to the Sangha. The ideal concatenation of circumstances is where the teacher is enlightened, the doctrine and the discipline are well proclaimed and well understood, the disciples are both able to practice and do practice, and senior teachers continue to perpetuate the Dharma and the discipline indefinitely based on correct understanding. So the Buddha is using this news that Ananda and Chunda have brought to him as a segue into a discussion of the right organization, right teaching, and right teacher, right teaching, and right organization, basically. The Buddha refers to his second meditation teacher from long ago, Uddaka Ramaputta. You may remember him long ago in the beginning. He's mentioned in the beginning of the Digha Nikaya. We haven't heard much about him since. This is, of course, the son or disciple of Rama, who, you will recall, taught Gautama how to experience the plane of neither perception nor non-perception, the highest plane of samsara. Uddaka Ramaputta was, of course, the Buddha's second meditation teacher. Some authorities say that Uddaka was a Brahmin, whereas others say that he was a Jain. In a previous talk, I've referred to him as a Jain, and his inclusion here suggests the latter, that he was in fact a Jain. Otherwise, him being brought into the story doesn't make much sense. He mentions a saying of Uddaka, quote, "He sees but does not see," unquote. This is another motif in the Pali Canon. The Buddha is often cited as quoting ancient sayings, in this case not so ancient a saying, but sayings, and giving them an alternative interpretation or giving them a deeper or explanatory interpretation. So in this case, the saying, "he sees but does not see," is associated with a rather obscure metaphor in which he compares the Dharma to a razor. Just as when one turns the razor on its edge, it disappears because the edge is so thin. So, just so is the Dharma pure and complete, there being nothing to add or subtract from it. as I said, the metaphor is obscure. It seems to be you're turning the razor about. The razor is the Dharma. You're turning it about. When you turn it about, trying to find something different about it, perhaps, it disappears because you're looking at it from an edge. So that there's nothing really to add or subtract from the Buddha's Dharma teachings. That's the message. The Buddha tells Chunda that the Sangha should regularly rehearse the teachings attained by the Buddha's super knowledge. That's Walsh's translation. I'm not fond of that word, but that's the word Walsh uses to refer to the Buddha's transcendent realization or direct knowledge or gnosis. Quote, setting meaning beside meaning and expression beside expression without dissension, in order that this holy life may continue and be established for a long time, for the profit and happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world, and for the benefit, profit, and happiness of devas and humans. Unquote. Once again, the Buddha reaffirms his role not merely as the teacher of men, but as the teacher of men and devas, or spiritual beings. This is a recurrent motif throughout the Pali Canon. Then the Buddha summarizes the 37 factors of enlightenment, namely the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 4 roads to power, the 5 spiritual faculties, the 5 mental powers, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the Noble Eightfold Path. Quote, these are the things that you should know, that you should recite together, unquote. We have, of course, discussed the 37 factors of enlightenment in previous talks, at least on 2 occasions that I can think of, so I'm not going to explain them again here. The Buddha then recites the method by which the continuing consensus of the assembly, that is the Sangha, may be maintained. Quote, if a fellow in the holy life quotes Dhamma in the assembly, and if you think he has either misunderstood the sense or expressed it wrongly, you should neither applaud nor reject it, but should say to him, friend, if you mean such and such, you should put it either like this or like that, which is the more appropriate? Or, if you say such and such, you mean either this or that, which is the more appropriate? If he replies, this meaning is better expressed like this than like that, or the sense of this expression is this rather than that, then his words should be neither rejected nor disparaged, but you should explain to him carefully the correct meaning and expression. Unquote. In other words, rational argument devoid of emotional bias pursued to the point of consensus is the proper method of Dharma exegesis according to the Buddha. He said something similar in an earlier sutta in the Digha Nikaya as well, when instructing the disciples on how to respond to critics of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And this description of how one is to approach the Dharma is my inspiration for these talks. That's exactly what I'm attempting to do in these talks by stepping back from all the sectarian literature, which of course followed the Pali Canon for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and looking at texts, looking at all of the texts in a fresh and in a really innocent way, attempting to reconcile the differences, collate the references, and explore what they mean without preconsiderations or biases. Unfortunately, this method only proved viable for about 116 years. Yes, in my opinion, it's the best method, Argus Portal. Unfortunately, it's not widely followed today in the Buddhist world, which is unfortunately rife with sectarianism and dogmatism and conservatism. And that's really, from my perspective, that's really the significance and importance of the Dharma transmission to the West, because now we have an opportunity to receive all of these traditions and look at them and bring them all back together again after 2,500 years. that still hasn't been achieved perfectly, and it probably won't be achieved until we have artificially intelligent computers, because of the absolute vast amount of material that Buddhism has generated in the last 2,500 years. It certainly is one of the spiritual systems of the world which has generated just an absolutely voluminous literature. But potentially in the next 100 years it may be possible to bring all of this material together into and reconcile it with itself, bring it back into a state of unity, which is really the meaning of the Ekayana, with which I would identify with the Dharma transmission to the West. Hence the name of my group, Dharma Transmission to the West. There's a little plug there. Unfortunately, this method only proved viable for about 116 years after the Parinibbana, the passing on of the Buddha, at which time, about 294 to 254 before the Common Era, the Sangha split into two competing factions. This was the original schism, called the Great Schism. The majority Mahasanghikas, who developed into the Mahayana, and the minority Stawiras, who developed into the Theravada sect, amongst others. Theravada came a little later, but ultimately the Stawiras developed into a number of sects, and one of those successor sects was the Theravada. Jospe asks, is there an unbroken line of descending from the Buddha Arahants? My opinion, there are certainly claims, many claims that there are. The Tibetans have various lineages. The Zenists, the Zen Buddhists, claim various lineages, and of course Theravada claims to be the direct successor philosophy of the original pre-sectarian form of Buddhism, which is preserved in what are known as the early Buddhist texts, the EBTs, essentially identical with the Sutta Pitaka. So that's a matter of opinion. My opinion is that there is no unbroken succession. That if we are to discover the true and original Buddhism, we have to look at the original texts and also look at everything that followed and bring them all into conformity with each other. That would be my prescription for reestablishing a unified and unbroken, a unified Sangha and an unbroken lineage. I don't believe that there are any truly unbroken lineages, although there are many claims and claimants. So, as I said, between about 294 and 254 BCE, the Sangha split into two competing factions, the majorities Mahasanghikas, who developed into the Mahayana, and the minority Stawiras, who developed into the Theravada sect, amongst others. That is the mainstream view today in terms of the original schism. The fact that the Buddha's 1,000-year Sangha, because he predicted that it would last 1,000 years, broke down so soon after the Buddha's death, 116 years, is not very long at all. In fact, a human lifespan is 120 years, so it's even theoretically possible that the Great Schism occurred within the lifespan of the longest-lived the disciples of the Buddha who came into the Sangha late, right up until the Buddha's death, and then lived as long as a human being possibly could. It's theoretically possible that they actually lived to see the Great Schism. This fact shows or suggests that the Sangha was torn by doctrinal strife from very early on. And we see hints of this, not so subtle hints either, in the canonical account of the first two Buddhist councils, which there is an account of them in the Vinaya. That is the debate over how strictly the rules of the Vinaya were to be kept, the apparent conflict between the followers of Mahakassapa and the followers of Ananda, the misogynistic attitude to women and female monastics, and the debate associated with Mahadeva over whether the insight of the Arhants was infallible, and even before, during the Buddha's own life. For example, the revolt of the Buddha's cousin, Devadatta, who tried to establish his own Sangha, and when he failed in that, he tried to murder the Buddha. The Buddha tells Chunda that he teaches a doctrine for restraining the corruptions in the present and destroying them in future lives. To achieve this, the monastics should observe a way of life in which clothing should only be enough to ward off heat and cold, insects, bugs, wind and sun, and to hide the private parts. Alms food should only be enough to provide adequate nourishment for the body and keep it unimpaired by satisfying the sensation of hunger. Shelter should only be enough to ward off cold and heat, insects, bugs, wind, sun, and the effects of the seasons, and to ensure the enjoyment of seclusion. Medicines and medical treatments should only be enough to cure sickness and maintain health. By the self-indulgent standards of our society, this would be considered a dangerous asceticism, to quote the words of a young student of mine. But by the standards of the ascetics of the Buddha's time, this was considered rank hedonism. Starvation, for example, was commonly practiced and regarded as a necessity. We know this from the 6 years of asceticism in which the Buddha engaged before he achieved enlightenment, and which brought him to the point of dying. The Buddha suffered from this accusation of pleasure-seeking and laxness throughout his entire life. You see this accusation leveled against him repeatedly in the suttas. The Buddha's response to this accusation is interesting. He doesn't deny it, which may surprise some Buddhists of the religious fundamentalist variety who worship mummies in their temples and starve or burn themselves to death, things that are utterly incompatible with what the Buddha actually taught. Rather, he says there are two types of pleasures, ignoble and noble. He identifies 4 types of pleasure, quote, low, vulgar, worldly, ignoble, and not conducive to welfare, unquote. These are pleasure in killing, in stealing, in lying, and in sensuality. And of course, you will recognize here the four of the 5 precepts of Pansil. The Buddha calls these, quote, the 4 kinds of devotion to pleasure, unquote. You will, of course, as I just said, you will, of course, recognize this list as the first 4 precepts of Pansil, which we've discussed in previous talks, so I'm not going to go into that in any more detail in this talk. You will recall our previous discussion of Pansil. I'm going to bring this to your mind, however, in which I said that on many occasions in the Pali Canon, the 5th precept prohibiting alcohol is not mentioned. And here again we see the list explicitly identified as consisting of 4 items only, and alcohol is not included. This is something, because it's so commonly, it's not that I'm particularly enamored of drinking alcohol, but it's so commonly stated in the popular Buddhist literature that not drinking alcohol is one of these principles, that and it's so frequently violated in the suttas that I'm pointing it out when it occurs, just to show you just how frequently this exception does occur. The Buddha says that these forms of pleasure-seeking are not conducive to enlightenment and are not recommended by him. So that group of pleasures is rejected explicitly by the Buddha. There are, however, 4 types of pleasure that the Buddha does recommend strongly and that are conducive to enlightenment. These are the 4 jhanas, which I generally translate, I have come to translate these as the 4 ecstatic states, or simply ecstasies. And you'll see them on the board behind me. You will see a table summarizing these. This recognition that the jhanas are themselves pleasurable is a distinguishing characteristic of the Buddha Dharma, relating ultimately to his realization, after rejecting asceticism and nourishing himself back to health, that pleasure may be wholesome or unwholesome or wholesome, and that pleasure in and of itself is not necessarily something to be rejected, beginning with his childhood experience of meditation under the rose apple tree. And there's a wide view or a wide perception amongst people, for example, and I've talked about this in other talks too, that nirvana, for example, the ultimate attainment, is a kind of zero state, a kind of neutral state in which there is neither pleasure nor pain. Actually, if you actually look at the descriptions of nirvana in the Pali Canon, you will see that nirvana is invariably described as a blissful, ecstatic state. Although we've discussed the four jhanas before, so I'm not going to go into too deep or extensive an explanation of them, I will briefly recap the characteristics of each one as explained in the Sutta, and I've done that, as I say, on the board behind me. I've done a classification of them there, so you'll see that the jhanas, we're talking only today about the first four jhanas. There are 8 in total, but when one refers to the jhanas, one is generally referring to the first 4. They have no name. They're simply numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4. They correspond, of course, to progressively exalted levels in the Buddhist cosmology. And they're classified in terms of 3 things: the immediate cause, the mental state corresponding to each one, and the feeling state corresponding to each one. And you'll notice in terms of the immediate cause, the first 2 are positive, detachment, and if you consider detachment to be a positive state, and concentration. But then the last 2 represent a continuum in which delight fades and then pleasure and pain are given up. So the first 2 may be regarded as positive and the latter 2 as negative in a progressive continuum of states. The mental state of the first jhana is associated with thinking and pondering, so cognitive activity still occurs. It's not a transcendent state in that sense. Reasoning and cognition still occur. And then the second jhana, as a result of concentration or oneness of mind, thinking and pondering subside, and one experiences inner tranquility. And the third is characterized by imperturbability, mindfulness, and clarity. And finally, in the fourth, the former gladness and sadness disappears and is purified by the experience of equanimity and mindfulness. And the feeling state that corresponds to these, in the first 2 states, when it's filled with delight and happiness, and then that becomes, in the third jhana, that becomes the delight and happiness becomes the joy of equanimity and mindfulness, so it's still a happy or delightful state. And then finally, the fourth state is beyond pleasure and pain. Quoting, "These are the 4 kinds of life devoted to pleasure, which are entirely conducive to disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to tranquility, to realization, to enlightenment, to nibbana. So if wanderers from other sects should say that the followers of the Sakyan are addicted," note that word, addicted, "to these 4 forms of pleasure-seeking, they should be told yes. For they would be speaking correctly about you. They would not be slandering you with false or untrue statements." So that's a pretty remarkable statement. The Buddha is acknowledging that the pursuit of the jhanas is actually an expression of addiction to pleasure, a certain kind of pleasure, however, a pleasure which is wholesome and leads to emancipation. Jospe asks, "Beyond pleasure and pain, transcended duality." Yes, you will find many references to the transcendence of duality in the Pali Canon, and that is one of them. The only way of reconciling the 2 references is that we're talking about a progressive subtilization, if you like, of feeling. So it's the bliss of jhana, the bliss of nirvana, which is beyond even the 4th jhana. It's still a blissful state. It's beyond pleasure and pain, but it's still essentially ecstatic or blissful. Paradoxical, I know, but it depends really on the specific connotation of the word pleasure. Ecstasy is the same. The ecstasy of transcendence is quite other than what we vulgarly refer to as pleasure, but it's still a blissful state. While some Buddhists might be surprised by my choice of ecstasy to translate the Pali word jhana with its connotation of pleasure-seeking, this translation is perfectly orthodox based on the Pali English Dictionary, and I invite you to look up jhana in the Pali English Dictionary to confirm what I'm saying. The word has far deeper and more profound significance than mere pleasure-seeking, with connotations of shamanic transcendence, transcendent realization, and utter blissfulness. So the attainment, emancipation, nirvana, whatever term you wish to use, many Westerners see, oh, nirvana, extinction of desire, it sounds boring. It sounds very negative. I don't want to experience that. In fact, although that is a common perception of nirvana in the West, it's based on a misunderstanding of the concept. And you can see that in the Pali Canon if you actually look at how it is described. The Buddha says that the four ecstasies have four fruits or results, referring to the four stages of accomplishment: stream entry, once returning, non-returning, and arahantship. These grades are attained by the destruction of the corruptions, namely identity view or self-view, belief in an ego essentially, doubt, attachment to rules and rituals. One could also add dogmas there, rules, rituals, and dogmas. Sensual desire, ill will, craving for existence, both gross and subtle. So the longing for heaven is still, for example, an example of craving for existence. Conceit, restlessness, and ignorance. We've discussed these in previous talks, and I'm not going to go into this again today either. These doctrines, he says, are as deeply rooted and immovable as the heartwood or iron post buried in the earth, which would have been buried to a depth of about 3 feet. He's referring to an actual object which was known at that time. This was the middle of the middle pillar, if you like, of the threshold gate of a city, which was buried to a depth of about 3 feet, and was made either of iron or heartwood. As a metaphor, this recalls both the middle way. It's not one of the side gates, it's the middle gate, or the middle pillar, I should say. We also find this symbolism in Kabbalah, interestingly. So it recalls both the middle way and the Buddha's comparison of the Dharma to an abandoned and long-forgotten city in the midst of an ancient and trackless forest, and I have discussed that before. I'd also point out that the reference to heartwood is something the Buddha has also, he's used that metaphor also previously in the Digha Nikaya, I think in the Digha, somewhere in the Pali Canon in any case, in which he's taken the heartwood of the tree as a metaphor for the Dharma and also for emancipation, for realization. An arhat has destroyed the corruptions, completely destroyed the fetter of becoming or rebirth, and liberated himself by supreme insight or wisdom, and I've talked about that before, how wisdom is the essential salvific principle, not morality and not meditation, but wisdom. This is something that pervades the Pali Canon. I've talked about this before as well, so I'm not going to dwell on it here. The last point becoming a bone of contention during or after the Second Buddhist Council, that is the reference to wisdom. And the instigator of that was one Mahadeva, who questioned the infallibility of arhants. This became a big issue after the Buddha's death. According to the Theravadins, this occurred about 135 years after the Parinibbana, and the dating is contested, but the 5 points of Mahadeva, whoever and whenever he flourished, clearly questioned the infallibility of arhants. this became a fundamental principle of Mahayana, of course, which rejects the idea that the arhants are infallible. And according to the Sutta, an arhat is incapable of 9 things. He's incapable of killing, he's incapable of stealing, he's incapable of sexual intercourse, which probably does not mean that he was impotent, but simply that he was unwilling. He's incapable of lying, he's incapable of hoarding possessions, hence the principle that if one becomes an arhat as a householder, which may again surprise some of you, it's very common to read in the popular literature that one must be a monastic in order to achieve emancipation. This is actually not correct in terms of the early Buddhist texts. A householder also can attain emancipation. However, there is a principle that having attained emancipation, a householder would immediately become a monastic or die, because an arhat is incapable of hoarding possessions. He's incapable of attachment, he's incapable of hatred, he's incapable of folly, and he's incapable of fear. The Sutta makes a further very interesting statement about the Buddhist understanding of the nature of time. The Buddha notes that his critics may say that he possesses boundless knowledge and insight concerning the past, but not concerning the future. Elsewhere in the Pali Canon, the Buddha states clearly that he does not know the future. I find this more interesting than the Sutta's statement that he was able to remember his past lives and knew that he would have no more future rebirths, which are the conventional and so not something that will surprise anyone or something that we need to discuss further here. These statements imply a view of time that is indeterministic, which has only become the dominant view of physics since Einstein, so in the last 100-odd years. It's not that the Buddha does not know the future, the Buddha says, but rather that the future is intrinsically unknowable because of the non-causal factor of volition or intention. The Pali word is Cetana, which coexists, of course, with determinism through the law of karma, the principle of causality. The Buddha certainly is not refuting the law of causality. And it's very clear in the Pali Canon that he recognizes causality as an absolute. But the totality of future experience cannot simply be reduced to causality. Causes have effects, and effects produce and effects operate as causes, but there is something more that makes the future indeterminate, and that is the principle of volition or intention, which of course is the principle that the Buddha says is the underlying cause of karma itself, not action, as we discussed at the beginning of this talk in connection with Jainism. In previous talks, we've talked about the meaning of the word Tathagata, the mysterious name that the Buddha used to refer to himself. That means something like he who went this way. Interpretations vary. In this sutta, he gives several explications of the meaning of this phrase, including the one who declares the time, the fact, the advantage, the Dhamma, and the discipline. Whatever in this world with its devas and maras, or demons, and brahmas, with its ascetics and brahmins, its princes and people, is seen by people, heard, sensed, cognized, whatever was ever achieved, sought after, or mentally pondered upon, all that has been fully understood by the Tathagata. Between the night in which the Tathagata gains supreme enlightenment and the night in which he attains the nirvana element, the essential ontological principle, the nirvana element without remainder, whatever he proclaims, says, or explains is so and not otherwise, and the Tathagata is the unvanquished conqueror, the seer and ruler of all. So this is I don't know how etymological it is, because it differs actually from some of the etymological interpretations, which are more like he who realized the suchness of existence and having gone a certain way has disappeared or vanished. That's the convention, the view of the meaning of Tathagata from an etymological perspective. Here, the Buddha is saying the meaning of the word Tathagata is that he is the declarer. He is the one who understands fully or completely. He is the one who proclaims, says, or what he proclaims and says or explains is so and not otherwise. So the truth teller, and also the conqueror and ruler of everything. He who has overcome samsara. The Buddha states that he has not revealed the future post-mortem status of a Tathagata, whether he exists or does not exist, not because there is no answer to this question, but because the question is not conducive to enlightenment. Rather, he has revealed the Four Noble Truths. Thus, the Buddha distinguishes between theory and practice. This is often interpreted to mean, again, in the popular literature, that the Buddha has no view of the nature of reality, no ontology or cosmology, but the entire Pali Canon stands in refutation of this assertion. Thus, the Buddha says, quote, "Those bases of speculation about the beginnings of things I have explained to you as they should be explained." Unquote. If we interpret the Pali Canon as a whole and in its entirety, rather than pre-selecting bits and pieces that conform to our own particular sectarian prejudice, we must conclude that the Buddha taught on two levels. A lower ordination, the Pali word is pabhaja, literally renunciation, consisting of practice or praxis. For those, if you see a question, I'm just going to finish my sentence and then I'll look at it. So a lower ordination, pabhaja, literally renunciation, consisting of practice for those who have not attained realization, and a higher ordination, upasampada, literally elder, consisting of wisdom for those who have attained realization, referred to in the tradition as teras. This is what we find if we examine the suttas in their totality. Otherwise, theory is just speculation. This is the Buddha's point, not that he has no ontology or cosmology. Rather, the Buddha teaches the destruction and transcendence of all speculative views and opinions concerning the past and the future by means of the four foundations of mindfulness. These too I have discussed in past talks and will not repeat myself here. So that concludes the talk. I do see that there was a question. Jospe says, how can Buddha have meant to be the ruler of everything? I can think of two possible interpretations of that phrase, one more magical or tantric than the other. The first, and I think the minimum or basic meaning would be that the Buddha has conquered everything within himself. He has conquered all of the temptations, all of the attachments, all of the delusions and illusions of samsara. He has seen through samsara and understands it perfectly and has eliminated all of the emotional baggage associated with it. In the process of becoming a Buddha, he has perfected and purified himself and eliminated all of that from himself. And that is why he is now freed from rebirth. So that does have an ontological implication, which is why it's so absurd to say that the Buddha had no ontology, because right there you have ontology. He is freed from rebirth. That is an ontological statement. The more magical or tantric view, which came into prominence later, would imply that the Buddha also has magical powers or psychic powers over samsara. That having conquered samsara in himself, he is now its master and because he understands it perfectly and has seen through it perfectly, he can effect effects in the world which only a Tathagata can do. Which of those two interpretations you choose to accept, or whether you accept both of them, is of course a matter for you. I can't say definitively that one way or the other. Certainly the first interpretation is basic and is necessarily implied by the Buddha, but as to whether that necessarily implies magical powers or not, that's a matter of view. But of course there are schools of Buddhism which hold precisely that view. So that's the talk. Any questions or discussion before we proceed to the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings? We only have, what, 30, 31, 32, 4 talks left, right? 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. 5 talks left. And then we have reached the end. I'm thinking of having a draw for a copy of the book. It's going to be cloth covered, so it's going to be fairly expensive. I wish I could just hand out copies to all of you, but unfortunately, as an unemployed person, I'm not able to do that. But we might have a draw at the end for a copy of the book, and one lucky person will get a copy. Any questions, discussion, or comments before we can proceed on with the dedication of merit? Also, if you would like a copy of the note card of this talk, it's available. Please IM me after the talk, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of the note card. And I'll also be going to the circle in Zhangzhung, which is located in the Visit Atoll Sim, if people are interested in having an impromptu Dharma chat. So it seems there are no questions, so let's proceed then with the dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege, as always. I am giving talks on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. Second Life time at the Chitta Bhavana Ashram, and also I'll be back here at the Buddhist Center next Sunday at 2 p.m. Second Life time to discuss the next Sutta, Sutta number 30 of the Digha Nikaya. Thank you very much. Namaskar.